Hello everyone, it's Jen Kramer, and today we're going to talk about 3 different ways that you can center things using CSS. There are 3 different methodologies because there are different use cases for each one of these methodologies. It is not that the first 2 are old school and the last one is what we do now, which is what I often hear out there on the internet. No, we have 3 ways of centering things because they're all needed. So we're going to talk about lining things using text align of center. We're going to talk about margin 0 auto, and we're going to talk about flexbox as a way of setting these things up. And we're going to start here by looking at our HTML. You'll see here that we have a series of divs. I've made them all exactly the same. They just have different classes on them so that we can style them slightly differently. And then down here in our CSS, this is where we're going to explore each one of these methodologies. And below that, I have my extra fine, super beautiful styling, which is in place so that you can keep track of what is going on here. So the divs are yellow, the H1 is black, and the paragraph is blue. So the first thing that I'm going to point out here from our HTML is that all of these elements have a display value of block. By default, comes with your web browser. And anytime you have a block element that displays here, whether you assign it a value of display block or whether it comes that way from your web browser, it is as wide as its containing element by default. That means that in the case of these div elements, they are contained inside of the body element. Even though you can't see it here inside of CodePen, there is a body element wrapping around this. The body element is as wide as our viewport, so therefore our div is as wide as our viewport. And in the absence of setting any width properties, then our H1 and our paragraph are also going to be as wide as the div, which is as wide as the viewport. So that's why these things stretch all the way across. That's the first thing to know as we start to work into this. And it is part of the reason that centering seems so difficult as you work here in CSS, because often you try techniques that are not intended to fill a certain use case, but you're trying to get them to use that. I know a lot of you just go text align center, and if it doesn't work, doesn't work. And then we go margin 0 auto, and if it doesn't work, then we go to flexbox and just hope for the best. We have no idea why one thing works and something else doesn't. So let's go through each of these individually. So that being our HTML there, let us scroll on down here to example number 1. And what I want to do, my goal is to center the text in the middle of the web page. So many of you will simply do this, text align of center. And sure enough, the text will align in the center of the web page. Phew, thank goodness we are all done. Well, this works at this moment in time because these elements stretch all the way across our viewport, because we have no widths that are set anywhere inside of our code. The moment we come through and we say width of, let's say, 50%, that text is no longer in the middle of the viewport anymore. It is now what? It's still centered, as you can see from my fine coloring here, but it is centered within the box that is here, which is now towards the left side of the page. And this brings in another one of my favorite rants. If I were to comment out the styling here that controls the colors and so forth, you would look at that and say, oh my goodness, I have no idea what's going on. Why is it sort of kind of over on the left side? I said text align center. That is nowhere near centered. If you can't see it, you can't style it. So here we have some text that is doing something. We have no idea why it's doing it because we can't see all of the associated boxes with it. That's why putting in our, they're really not all that pretty. But I like using the not pretty colors as I teach this because I want to be really clear, this is not my final styling, okay? So that is the purpose of text align center. It is going to align the text in the center of its containing element. If you have too much text, so for example, if we were to go to example 1 here and copy that, and let's be really excited about example 1. We'll put it in several times. The browser is very happily going to try to align in the center as much of that text as possible and wrap it onto additional lines. In fact, we'll show you that that works that way just by taking out the last one of those. And you'll see that this aligns very nicely in the center, but it's the center of that particular box. Okay, so the next thing you might want to try is here in example number 2, if you were to say margin 0 auto. And so what this means is we are going to set our margin to only 2 values. Anytime we have 2 values, that means that this is shorthand for 4 values. And that's shorthand for spelling out margin top, margin left, margin bottom, margin right as 4 individual properties. So that's what's going on here. When you have 4 values like this, think about this as the hands of the clock, top, right, bottom, left. Those are the 4 numbers. Or you can just remember trouble, TRBL. Remember that and stay out of trouble. So what we have here is I had a 3 rem space in between each one of these boxes, but now I have 0 on the top and 0 on the bottom. That space has disappeared, so I could bring that back by putting in 3 rem there. So the margin property is working because if it wasn't, that little issue there wouldn't have changed anything. What happens here is the purpose of auto, and the best way to describe that is by putting in a width of 50%. So now it works, but we've aligned the box in the middle of the page, okay? So the way that margin trick works is the browser is going to look at what is occupied, which is the box, that div, which has a width of 50%, and what is not occupied, which is all of the other space to the right of it in this particular case. What the browser will do is take that space, divide it by 2, so 25% in this case, and stick it on either side of that box. So this methodology is designed to align a box, a block level element, in the middle of some space, which assumes that that block level element has a width assigned to it. If there are no widths assigned to it and things continue to stretch through the page and everything is as wide as the body, this will not work. Note that if you now want to align the text in the middle of this box, you are going to need to add a text align center in order to align the text in the box, which is now in the middle of the screen. So you may need to combine these techniques. So that's the purpose of that. Notice that we were able to align the box and align the text in just 3 lines of code in this particular situation. Because next we're moving on to Flexbox, which is where a lot of you say, oh, Flexbox, it's so easy to center things. But Flexbox takes more code to do the same thing. So let's take a look at how that works. Remember, Flexbox is all about parents and children. So in order to make this work in this particular situation, we're going to have our div with a class of ex3. That is going to be the parent. The h1 and the p, those are the children, also called the flex container div with a class of ex3, the flex container. And the h1 and the p would be the flex items. So what we have to do here, first of all, is declare that we are going to use display flex. That's always the first step, and it's going to make your page look really wacky here. This is Flexbox with its default behavior. In this case, the 2 flex items, the children here, are as wide as their content by default, and they are in a row, and that is what this is doing here. So we're going to add to this a flex flow of row wrap, which is often what we do in our layouts. We usually think about things in terms of row, although you could do this with columns instead, although it gets a little bit trickier towards the end if you do that. Then we could say something like justify content center. And well, that'll at least move our boxes to the center of the row. Yeah. So that's nice, sort of. But they are still, of course, next to each other. So in order to get them not next to each other, we could say .ex3 and then a star here. So if you're not familiar with that particular selector, this is with a class. Always write your selectors from left to right, read them from right to left. So what we're saying here is any child, this is the parent-child selector. So any child of EX3, these particular styles will apply to. So this will apply to both the H1 and the P in a very efficient little selector here. We'll say our flex basis is 100%. So that will stretch things all the way across the screen. So now we have two declarations to get us back to where we started. Awesome. And our text is still not aligned in the center. You are still going to have to add here text align center in order to make this work. Okay. Now, for those of you who are saying, but Jen, you did it with a row. Why didn't you do it with a column? Well, that's a great point. Let's see what happens if we try to do this with a column instead. So if I said FlexFlow column wrap, then we would get right back to where we started. And we could say something like align items center. And that would push the two items to the center of the screen. Remember here, we're now working with columns. So justify content would work with the column orientation. Align items is for the cross axis, which in this case is what we normally would think of as rows going across the screen. So here we have our align items to center. Now we'll put our two items in the middle, but notice that they don't look like the other ones. And that's because those particular elements are now under control of Flexbox and they are as wide as their content. So you think, well, we just do the same thing again. We'll say EX3 and the children thing that we just did, flex basis of 100%, or whatever else you wanted to try here. Those properties are not going to work the way you expect because we are working on a different set of axes. And this is just simply not going to work in this particular context. So that is couple of different ways that you can center elements on your web page. And what I would say to you and argue to you is that text align center is still a really great way of doing this. This is going to take your text and align it in the center of its containing element, whatever that containing element might happen to be. An H1, a paragraph, a div, anything else. It can be inherited. It can be passed on to its children, so be aware of that as well. The margin 0 auto is great for taking a box and simply aligning it in space. And Flexbox, if you're trying to use this on your text to align it, it is a really kind of a disaster. It is a far better way of aligning, say, your div element itself. If you wanted to align your div element in the middle in space, this would be a legitimate way of doing it, but don't try this stuff with the text that I just did. Flexbox was never intended to work that way. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time.